Going live
All
in
right.
5, 4, 3.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Petersheim Academic Expo and the Mandela King Symposium on Global Justice. This symposium was conceived of several years ago by the Martin Luther King Leadership Program as a way of honoring the legacy of both Nelson Mandela, Madiba, as he was called affectionately by his people, and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Um, it's an interesting parallel with these two men, different periods of time. Probably Nelson Mandela being inspired by also Dr. King's legacy and seeing himself as the focus point for revolutionary change in South Africa. So we are honored to consider carrying their names forward as a means of honoring their legacy. I know many people are generally familiar with one or two aspects of Dr. King's life, but sometimes I like to drop a little bit of knowledge and wisdom on people on things that they don't know. Usually, most people have I call it a one-dimensional understanding of Dr. King. They basically know he made one speech and that he may have been assassinated. But another nice little trivia piece for many is that when he was a young boy, his father made a pilgrimage, if you would, to Europe to saturate his own theological roots. And as his father learned more about the legacy and the impact of Martin Luther and his ultimate actions, which led to what may be called perhaps Protestant value system through his acts of protest at the seminary there. Michael King Sr. Was so impressed by that as he returned, or Daddy King, when he returned to the United States. So impressed with the impact of Martin Luther's legacy that he himself changed their names. And the man we call Martin Luther King was actually born as Michael King. But both father and son had their names changed. So I thought I would share that little piece of wisdom. And one other aspect I could mention about Nelson Mandela, because many people are familiar with his decades of imprisonment, his subsequent release, which was a negotiated settlement at that time because of sustained agitation in South Africa by the ANC and many other groups. But what relative to social justice and the decades, the century of oppression of that indigenous population, one of the many social justice models that Nelson Mandela developed as a goal for the nation as president was to build 1 million houses for Black South Africans as a result, if you think about it, decades of living under the apartheid system. So in that context, we know that progressive scholars and many others are on the battlefields each and every day in the 21st century, looking at ways in which we can make society better and the ways in which we need to be transformative agents of what I call God's will on this earth. God put Adam and Eve in the garden to have a good time, and it seems like sometimes we as humans, all we do is mess up the activity, but many of us who are of goodwill want to share that sense of peace and contentment with others so that we all may prosper together. And heaven knows during this period of the pandemic, the world needs to understand the light that may be at the end of that tunnel is a good and positive light. Behind every storm, there may be a rainbow. And we are proud to be a part of doing what we do at Seton Hall, not only for Seton Hall, but for the global community at large. I'm going to mention our panelists. I'm going to give you the order of their presentations and simply tell you a little bit now about each of their backgrounds, and so that we can appreciate their presence with us today. First, we'll be listening to Dr. Kirk Johnson, who is a faculty in our School of Arts and Sciences in the area of Religious Studies. Dorothy Carolina, who was in our School of Nursing. Dr. Rosamond Marabella in Political Science, but we'll be talking about her work with public administration. Richard Winchester, a member of our law school faculty as a visiting scholar. Kyle Younger, Director of Professional Services for the School of Diplomacy at Seton Hall. Dr. Kelly Harris, who is the Chair of Africana Studies. If any of the participants would like to share anything else about their backgrounds, so to speak, as they do their own introductions, they should feel free to do that. I'm now going to ask Dr. Kirk Johnson to start, and the order in which I did announce everyone is the order in which we will be presenting today. So Dr. Johnson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Pritchett, and thank you for the opportunity to share. Good morning, everybody. In addition to me teaching theology and religion, I'm also a bioethicist. I actually partake in the Biomedical Ethics Committee for Atlantic Health Systems, specifically in Overlook Medical Center in Summit, New Jersey. And I said that because I want to share that is connected to my presentation. But for the most part, I'm going to examine, of course, COVID-19 and the theological premises behind COVID-19. And basically, we've been watching the news and other news outlets regarding COVID-19 and the theological responses to COVID-19, to the coronavirus. And it comes down to two things, of course, convictions and understandings of faith, right? And versus the practices of well-being. So for the most part, regardless of the faith tradition you're in or the religious or spiritual tradition you're in, majority of people are obedient to the social distancing measures. The great majority, fortunately. But as we have seen, there have been instances across all religious circles that there are a small handful of individuals that aren't obedient to these particular measures, and they claim religious exemption to say that, of course, I'm religiously exempt and I should be able to hold worship services because, well, that is my conviction, that is my understanding of God, that is my theology. And of course, I know I have a legal scholar after me, so he could actually chime in and really emphasize this as well. There's a balance between, of course, legality and morality in these understandings and practices, right? But unfortunately, because of individuals who are not obeying these particular laws, we hear reports that a lot of individuals, clergy and congregants, or imams, or rabbis, pastors, whatever particular terminology you would like to use, have gotten sick from COVID-19, and unfortunately some of them have died, as well as those individuals that worship in those particular religious settings. So here you have the issue of theodicy, right? Theodicy is a term, if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, how come evil exists in the world? How come sickness and disease and all these other elements exist in the world? And these are questions that are continuing to be raised. For example, September 11, 2001, questions of theodicy have been raised. The Holocaust, wars, any particular instance where a lot of people have died or are experiencing sickness or illness or suffering, the question of theodicy comes into play. And of course, there's no valid answer in regards to theology and God in these particular instances. However, what we can do as human beings, that's important. Our response or responses are important. And we, I believe, could answer these really philosophical, theological, tough issues by hospitality and community. For example, the golden rule, right? Treat others the way you want to be treated. And because of COVID-19, we see Asian Americans, for example, that are being attacked, saying it's your fault that COVID-19, the coronavirus, has happened, which has a lot of unethical dimensions to it. African Americans, in regards to the social determinants of health or health disparities, are being heavily impacted, as well as Hispanics as well, and immigrants are being heavily impacted in regards to the coronavirus. And it's not just because of the pandemic, but there are other social factors and variants that come into play with this. Muslims in India have been blamed, for example, because India is dominantly Buddhist and a Hindu type of religious culture. And they have been blamed, reports have shown, in regards to the coronavirus. And also Africans in China also have been blamed in regards to the coronavirus. So you have the interplay between religion, theology, understanding of God, and medicine, all meshed into one. And of course, these are complex issues, but how can we actually at least alleviate these particular issues? Well, treat others the way you want to be treated. Have a value of hospitality and the value of community as well. I also think that we need to change the language of social distancing. To me, it's not really social distancing, but it is physical distancing. We're connected through technology, for example, through Microsoft Teams, doing the Petershine particular exploration. So I think when we say social distancing, it brings the particular mentality that we're lonely, right? And of course, mental health issues and all these other different variables come into play. But we have technology, fortunately. You could not just call somebody, you could Zoom, you could use Microsoft Teams, you could use Skype, you could use FaceTime, Facebook Live, YouTube, where there's so many different social outlets that we could use in order to be as connected as possible. So physically we're not connected, but of course I believe socially we're connected. So I think we should start changing that language in regards to that. Also, religious communities have been using Facebook Live for their particular religious practices and services. Zoom, also YouTube has been used. I know Zoom has been a big, and Microsoft Teams has been a big platform so that individuals could still experience worship online, whether if you're Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, whatever, but it will be in a great particular safe context that you could still worship and practice in a unique, well, not so unique because online services has been around for at least 10 years, but you could still participate in religious communities as well. Also, religious communities have been on the forefront of disinfecting and honoring at least 50 people or under in their worship contexts. I have friends that are actually imams, pastors, and rabbis as well. And they, for the most part, actually, them physically by themselves go to their particular worship center, and then they stream live, whether a sermon or a homily or whatever particular religious exploration and expression they use. And I think because of the pandemic, it has forced all religious contexts to rethink religious practices in the 21st century, right? We have to be creative. And I think that is one positive thing that the pandemic actually has forced us to do. There are a lot of negative aspects of the pandemic, but the positive is our resilience, our perseverance, and our creativity. So these are just some thoughts that I wanted to share in connections between currently what we're dealing with now. And I would like to close with a quick 2-minute video of drive-through worship, another creative idea of how we could worship in our particular religious context without, of course, posing the threat of the spreading of a virus. So I'm going to share my screen, and any comments or thoughts are definitely welcomed here. So just give me one moment.
Kirk, I hate to interrupt you, but using the Teams live event, you're not going to be able to share embedded audio. You can share the video, but the audio won't carry. It's a shortcoming of Teams live event. I apologize for that.
Oh, okay. That's no problem. Well, basically, I could just explain what the video is. Basically, just like the concept of a drive-through theater, these are old school type of memes, and actually drive-through theaters are making a comeback because of COVID-19. But basically, and of course, this is a context where the church actually has a huge parking lot, so they could actually pack in a bunch of cars and have worship services. But basically, the pastor of this church in Texas invites their congregants to come, and they have worship in the parking lot. They have big speakers, and the pastor has an actual microphone, and they be able to do worship just like in person, but of course using the, well, my terminology, physical distancing, but of course the overarching terminology is social distancing. And it's a great way in order to still have some type of normalcy for congregants, at least in this Christian context, to worship in a safe and productive and efficient way. So that's what basically the video is about. So yes, that is my presentation, just some of my thoughts. Any questions or comments?
I don't have any questions coming in through the chat, Kurt. So what I will do is, if any do come in, I will announce this to our audience. What you may do, avail yourself of the instant chat function and mechanism, and or you could send me an email question for any of the speakers or myself, and I'll be gladly will follow that through, because we know that you have to move on to a class. We want to.
Yeah, I can stay for about probably another 5 minutes or so, and
Thank
then
you so much.
I could log off.
And I'd like to announce that we have a Professor Katsionis, who's joined us from the School of Communication. And I'm just going to announce for her benefit that I think I'll have her speak just before Dr. Harris. And Dr. Harris will be our cleanup hitter, just for her benefit. All right, Dr. Johnson, do you have any final comments?
No, and again, remember, physical distancing, not social distancing. We do have the benefit of technology and social media, and as long as we use it the right way, we could still worship in our different various religious settings. We could still communicate with each other. I think that's an important element to really emphasize and to understand.
Thank you so much. We will now ask our good sister from the our Nutley campus, the School of Nursing, Dr. Dorothy Carolina, to now begin her presentation.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Pritchett, for inviting me to participate in this forum. I do have a PowerPoint slides or PowerPoints to share, and just give me a second so I can do that. Can everyone see the slides?
Yes, they can.
Okay. Yes, I am Dorothy Carolina. I am a clinical assistant professor at the College of Nursing on the North Orange campus, as we so fondly call our Nutley location. I've been a registered professional nurse for about 3 decades, and so I have seen many changes in healthcare over the 30 years since, I first stepped foot in the hospital as a young nurse. And again, healthcare has changed tremendously over that period of time with the advancement of treatments for certain disease states and technology and the like. But one thing that I noticed that hasn't changed much is the health status that the majority population enjoys when compared to the disparity in healthcare that the minority population seems to suffer from. And so I wanted to just speak from my background as a healthcare provider about health disparities and how this COVID-19 pandemic has shined a light on, the disparities of healthcare among the Black and brown populations in the United States.
Dr. Carolina, I'm not too sure if you launch, I'm presuming launch your, it may go full screen. Right now we're seeing your whole screen, but that's
Okay.
if you can't handle that, just go right ahead and we'll just do our best. There we go. That it is now full screen. Thank you.
You're welcome. So again, when we're talking about health disparities in the United States, when we use the term health disparity, it's kind of like an umbrella term, but there's more to it than, just that phrase health disparity. So on the screen, there are three terms that I want to share with you and just kind of briefly go over to give you some context for the discussion. So when we're talking about health disparities, and again, we use health disparities synonymously with disproportionate burden of health and of illness and death on a particular population. We need to recognize that there's more to health disparities than just that. So health disparity is defined as a population or exists when one population or group experiences a higher burden of disability or illness compared to another group, right? But when we look at health care disparity, which is a little different, it denotes the differences in access to healthcare services, health insurance, or quality of care or lack thereof. And then when we talk about health equity, we refer to health equity is that everyone, regardless of your race, your gender, your ethnicity, has the opportunity to attain his or her full health potential. So again, when we're describing health disparities in the United States, we view them from an individual lens. In other words, viewing them from individual behaviors, individual characteristics, as well as we view them from a systemic and structural factor. What factors from that vantage point influence health status or health disparities in the United States? Most of the literature that is written on health disparities really focuses on individual behaviors. In other words, what does an individual do that makes them more susceptible? What behaviors do they demonstrate which makes them more susceptible to disease, illness, death? So we're looking at, again, factors that explain health disparities in the United States. We're looking at individual behaviors, systemic or systematic and structural factors such as health provider bias, racism, limited access to medical services, lack of educational opportunities, residential segregation, etc. Cultural expectations and differences. In other words, what is it that's inherent in one's culture that influences or impacts their health status? Social factors. Race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, age, gender, sexual orientation. So again, all of these have been factors that have been used to explain health disparities that Black and brown communities experience in the United States. Social determinants of health. Again, these are explanations that sociologists and other healthcare experts have used to explain. So when we break down, again, what we believe are factors that influence or cause these disparities, we break them down in four categories. The first category is biologic, or is there something that genetically predisposes the individual to a specific health challenge? Psychosocial factors, those things include like stress, depression, their psychological state, how does that impact their health status? Behavioral factors, and we look at those things like risky behaviors, smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, having unprotected sex, so those taking drugs. those are risky or behavioral factors that inform or again explain why these individuals experience health disparities. And then again, we have those social factors that also have been used to explain. The World Health Organization explains social determinants of health by basically looking at the conditions under which people are born, they grow, live, work, and they age. Whereas the CDC looks at it from a more institutional, a more structural, and basically talking about the power and money and resources that are available to the individual and how that impacts their health or disease status. And again, there's a bunch of studies. The literature is replete with studies that indicate that there's a correlation between social determinants of health and health outcomes. But again, when we look at that from a research point of view or a sociologic or a health point of view, we again still try to understand. Now, again, I've been in nursing for over 30 years, and not much has changed in terms of Black and brown people being disproportionately affected by illness and death. And so what is it about being Black and brown in America that predisposes one to poor health? And again, going back, the studies looking at health disparity in America focus primarily on individual level behaviors. What is it about the individual that predisposes them? So when we're looking at African Americans and COVID-19, there's something that really, came out that, really wasn't a surprise to the people who are of Black and brown, or African descent, or, considered part of the minority population, that we would be overrepresented among reported coronavirus cases and death as we see it. And again, the explanation is we're sicker, we're poorer, and we have less access to care. And that may be true. And again, going back to the explanation as to why we're disproportionately affected, looking at individual level reasons as opposed to looking at it from a more structural or more institutional or using structural or institutionalized rationale for why that's the case. So it's funny, as I was preparing for this presentation, I went to look for stats to get some more information about what does COVID-19 look like? Who really is affected? Because again, when you look at the news, and I try not to look at the news so much, I try to guard my mind, but, you see headlines that indicate, Black and brown people are disproportionately affected. They have high, yes, okay, so let's go and try to get some stats to inform that. Can I just tell you, it was so difficult to find stats for the number of people who are Black or brown who have been affected by coronavirus in terms of illness rate and, more importantly, mortality rate. The government requires that states report that information, who the person is, the age group, the gender, but certain states, or it's very difficult to find states documenting the ethnic or the race of the individual who's dying. So again, I had to rely on news reports and some anecdotal information in order to provide you with the stats that you see on the screen right now. So the mortality rate for COVID-19 in African Americans of course, is higher across the country and in major cities. And again, states are required to report the ethnic breakdown. So for instance, in Chicago, African Americans represent 30% of the population. However, they represent 70% of all the coronavirus cases. So think about that, 30% in Chicago, but they comprise 70% of all the coronavirus death cases. Milwaukee County, African Americans comprise 27% of the population, but 81% of the coronavirus deaths. And the same thing with Michigan, 14% versus 40% death rate in that state. In New Jersey, African Americans represent 14% of the population, but 23% of all the deaths in New Jersey. So again, so the light is being, why is it that African Americans are, disproportionately represented in mortality rates in COVID-19? So again, I want to focus the presentation today not on individual factors, because again, the literature is replete with those studies that look at individual factors, but I think it's bigger than individual factors. From my vantage point, I think is more systematic as to why our people are dying at a disproportionate rate. So when we look at some of those structural and systematic factors, looking at poor access to educational opportunities. So again, individuals in these communities that are largely African American, they generally have poor educational opportunities. You have a high dropout rate for the students, right? They have very low graduation rates. If some of them go to college, many of them are not prepared to go to college, and they find themselves taking courses that are not for credit to, get them up to speed to where they need to be. But for those people who, don't graduate high school or just have a high school diploma, they are relegated to low-paying, low-wage jobs. And they are now considered a part of the essential workforce. So you have them in food service industries, they're grocery store clerks, they're bus drivers. Even in New York City, the governor of New York State, mentioned that the MTA, most of the employees that work for the MTA are Black and brown people. So because they're essential workers, they are overexposed because they are required to go to work every day. They don't have the luxury of working from home like we do. And so they're overexposed, number one. Number two, they have limited access to medical care services within their community. Many times, they have to go outside of their community to go and see a doctor because doctors are not, breaking down doors to set up shop within their communities. And so they don't have access, or they're not linked up to primary care services. And so many of them forego, and look to care for themselves for, things like colds and such. And so they're not connected to the healthcare facility until they actually get sick. So many of them are walking around with illnesses that they don't even know that they have, like diabetes, high blood pressure. One doesn't know they have, in many cases, know that they have high blood pressure until they've had a stroke and they find themselves in an ICU trying to get care. So another issue from a systematic standpoint is having access to local food markets or other resources in their community to meet their daily needs. Again, many individuals living in these communities have to go outside of the community just to grocery shop. Inadequate housing and residential segregation. Okay, a lot of them live in substandard housing. Redlining is alive and well in many of these communities. Many of them live in areas where they're exposed to pollutants and toxins from factories and such. And so that also impacts on their health and well-being. And ultimately, discrimination, racism, and distrust of the government. Whether we know it or not, these individuals and we ourselves experience racism and discrimination, but they experience it at a level that we probably don't understand. That it's, again, disproportionate to what we in some cases experience. I have some family members and some colleagues over the last couple of weeks who work in the front lines in hospital settings. And, you know, my sister-in-law in particular works at a large urban setting. And so I wanted to talk to her about who or what her experience was like working in the emergency room, you know, in a large urban center. And, you know, asking her questions about whether or not there were enough supplies, did she have enough PPE and ventilators, and who are these people coming into the emergency room? And she said to me, yes, we do have enough ventilators, which struck me as very odd. Because again, you know, when you hear the politicians and, you know, the healthcare providers talking about not having, you know, enough resources, she says, yes, we have enough ventilators. So I said, well, what are the people, who are these people that are coming in who are infected with COVID-19? She says, well, many of them are young men who are coming in their 30s, who are unemployed, who have no insurance, and, you know, they're presenting to us, you know, with these symptoms. I said, well, what happens to them? Well, she said, a lot of them, you know, when they sit in the emergency room, they sit in the emergency room for a time where their condition starts to deteriorate. So I said, well, then, okay, what happens? Are they getting the medication? And she said, yes. She said, but they die before they're able to get on the ventilator, which struck me as odd. Because again, if your condition deteriorates to the point where, because again, COVID-19 is a respiratory infection, that would stand to reason that these people are placed on ventilators. But then the question becomes, because the system is so overwhelmed and that the hospitals and the resources are not available, healthcare providers are put into a position where they have to decide who gets the resources and who doesn't. So when you're looking at, for example, you know, Andre, who comes into the emergency department, who is not married, who is unemployed, who has no health insurance, and who has 2 children, versus Richard, who comes into the emergency room, who's 56, who's married, who has 2 children, and, you know, has a job where he's a manager at a store. And they have to decide who gets to be on a ventilator. I mean, who decides who gets on the ventilator? You know, as a healthcare provider, who do you choose? And again, so when we're talking about systematic and structural factors, one of the things also too we need to think about or consider is implicit bias or unconscious bias. Okay, the literature it's well documented in the literature that, you know, African Americans and people of color, you know, experience implicit bias in terms of the care that they receive from the provider. So again, unconscious bias or implicit bias, those individuals are not aware that they're making decisions based upon stereotypes or some things that they believe. So again, putting all that together, poor access, you know, limited medical services, inability to meet their local, their daily needs, inadequate housing, putting that all in the pot, it's no wonder why African Americans are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. So what lessons have we learned from all of this? Well, ethnic and racial health disparities are probably worse than we ever could have imagined, right? It's worse than we could have imagined. And this COVID-19 pandemic actually shined a bright light on how far we need to go to bridge the healthcare disparity or the health equity gap. And stakeholders within the healthcare arena and policymakers and politicians need to be held accountable to ensure that the social and political determinants of health or no longer burden those who are at risk. One of the other things that I wanted to make note of as well is that there is a relationship between, you know, the provider in terms of what the provider looks like. If the provider is of the same ethnic or racial background, you know, as the patient they're caring for, that there is some benefit to that relationship in terms of the health status of the individual. So again, we need to increase the number of African American healthcare providers, because when you look at, you know, African Americans and where we are in terms of, the population and the demographic, we represent 14% of the population, but I know in nursing, Black nurses represent 5% of all the nurses in the United States, and African American physicians represent 2 to 3%. So again, this is a sobering moment for us as a country, to determine or to decide whether or not we're okay with health disparities in this country, that we're okay, or that we put our money where our mouths are and really put energy and effort and resources into turning this around, because we can no longer just focus on individual factors as it relates to health disparities, but we need to look more broader in terms of the structural and the systematic factors that put one at risk for developing health disparities in the United States.
Thank you, Dr. Carolina. We will now look toward our public administration sector, and we'll ask Dr. Roseanne Marabella of our political science faculty to begin her presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be with you, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this group presenting on these really important issues. I'm going to share my screen, and then we can get going. I'd like to speak to you today about the role of government and nonprofits in the time of COVID-19, taking a critical perspective on what has happened. I'm very pleased, Forrest, that you had me go after Dr. Carolina, because I think that some of what she has spoken about is going to feed right into what I have to say. So thank you, Dr. Carolina, for really giving us a good overview of the healthcare issues facing communities of color today. So I wanted to just start also talking about much of what you just talked about, COVID-19 and marginalized groups. So we now know 2 months, 3 months into this, that there are groups of people who are much more at risk of serious illness and disease. Absolutely people of color. We know that the elderly are much more at risk. I think in New Jersey, the percentage is 40% of people who have died have been the elderly. People with disabilities, which we're not hearing that much about, but they're out there, they're living in group facilities, and they are much more vulnerable. People who live in poverty, people who are homeless. There's a lot of intersectionality here, obviously, because oftentimes people who are of color are in poverty or homeless, and then migrants and refugees, immigrants. People who must continue to work outside the home are also more at risk. And we found out recently a wonderful article in the New York Times that showed that 1 in 3 jobs that are held by women have been designated as essential. So there's a gendered notion to who gets to work at home and who doesn't. People in the gig economy, people who drive Ubers, people who don't have full-time employment but have to do contractual kind of work, people working for Amazon. We're also dependent upon Amazon, and those people have to work. So employees of essential businesses, your supermarkets, transportation, food production, and then people who are many of these people at risk of serious illnesses are becoming infected in the workplace. And just recently we've seen some of the spotlight shown on meat packing plants where people have been working side by side, and some of the places where we have the biggest incidence of infections are in these kinds of facilities. And so there's two kinds of groups who are more at risk of this. And so what is the impact of COVID-19 on service providers from a government nonprofit perspective, which is what I study? So government workers, first responders, police officers, EMT folks, obviously healthcare workers, prison guards, teachers, transportation workers, sanitation workers. These folks are all at risk of becoming ill with the virus. And then nonprofit workers, people who work in nursing homes, people who staff food banks, people who work in group homes, halfway homes for people who have substance abuse, halfway homes for people coming out of prisons. All of these workers who are employed by government or the nonprofit sector are at risk of getting the virus as well. wanted to just take a moment to give a little bit of background for those of you who might not be familiar with what has happened with government, but beginning in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the UK, government started to back off from provision of services, and there was this notion that everything could be supplied by the market. And so the federal government in particular just really pulled back on providing money to state and local governments and to nonprofits. We call this devolution. There were also more hoops put in place that people had to jump through to receive services. We obviously know that during the Bill Clinton era, he changed the welfare policy so that there was a 5-year and you're out kind of policy. We've seen changes in food stamps. So there's been this notion that if the government can't provide it, the nonprofit sector is going to step in and philanthropy is going to fill the void. And we remember George H.W. Bush talking about the 1,000 points of light. Again, during this time, healthcare facilities began to operate like businesses. There was a shift to for-profit hospitals. There was an increased number of for-profit nursing homes. And we've seen increasingly how these sorts of things, you've seen it this past month where people, nurses and other healthcare workers in hospitals are getting fired because they're talking about a lack of PPE because the hospitals don't want their brand to look bad, right? So all those kinds of things where we're more concerned about public relations than we are concerned about the healthcare workers just sort of sheds a spotlight on how the corporatization and the profitization of the healthcare industry has added to this issue. And then finally, we all know that social enterprise and entrepreneurial approaches in service delivery, as we become more business-like, have really led us to think that the market could take care of all of it. So right now, as I could tell you as we speak, the nonprofit sector is in crisis, particularly in communities of color. Many nonprofits that are in communities and many larger nonprofits that are in communities of privilege and nonprofits that are very large are going to survive this pandemic. But those nonprofits that are vulnerable in the first place because of the marginalized groups that they serve can be expected to continue to decline. Donations to nonprofits will decline during this period of time. People have lost their jobs. I think today it's 26 million people have lost their jobs. So fewer people will be donating. People who do have money and do have jobs have seen a dip in their 401ks or in their portfolios of other types. So there's going to be fewer people able to make donations. We've seen that GoFundMe has been so inundated with people asking for money for everything, from parents asking for money to buy a laptop for their child so they could go to school, to healthcare workers asking for money for personal protective equipment. So GoFundMe is not going to be the place. And although philanthropic giving is at $1 billion worldwide, I ask you to compare that to the $2 trillion in the CARE Act. Clearly, $1 billion is not going to be enough to fill the gap that's going to be needed. And of that 1 billion, only 182 million of that is in the United States, and half of that is from the Gates Foundation, who's really focused on the healthcare piece of this, which is obviously very important, but not talking about, for instance, one of the biggest needs right now is food insecurity. There is so much food insecurity in this country right now, with people losing their jobs, people not being able to get food. And the food banks have been closing because they can't keep open because they have no donations and resources. So you might have seen food banks pop up in churches right now because there's a real need just for food for people to survive day to day. So the Coronavirus Act, Relief and Economic Security Act that just came through does provide money for nonprofits for funding through their Paycheck Protection Program and economic disaster loans. There's also increased incentives for charitable giving. However, we do know that that money ran out immediately. And yesterday, the federal government put more money into this. But I think it's the more savvy people who are getting this money right now. It's also the people that are more, have larger bank accounts and have better associations with their banks. And I think you're going to begin to see another level and layer of marginalized people. Their nonprofits are not going to be getting this money. Communities of color are not going to be getting this money. And I think that's really something that we need to look at. There's also the politics of COVID-19, which we could spend an hour on, and I know we don't have that time, but I'll just continue to tell you that this devolution of government has now meant there's little or no coordination by the federal government. We've seen the issues with PPE and ventilators. The states and localities are supposed to figure this out on their own. They're all bidding against each other to try and get what they need. The response from states is uneven, with some never closing, some getting ready to be reopened. There's been a lack of testing for viruses and antibodies. There's not only no money coming from the feds, but the Senate Majority Leader yesterday, Mitch McConnell, said Fed should just file for bankruptcy. And his staff members have crafted a memo called Stopping Blue States from Getting Relief. So it's very, very political, which during a pandemic, politics should be put aside. So we know that this pandemic has shed a light, as Dr. Carolina said so clearly, on inequality. There's a lack of access to healthcare. People of color are more apt to be deemed essential workers. We didn't even have time to talk about the digital divide in schooling when it went remote, that many students in communities of color or in impoverished communities don't have access to the equipment that they need to be able to learn from home. We also know that poverty around the world will rise. We've already seen the impact of this. We can expect vast amounts of starvation, illiteracy, and poverty to be secondary things that happen after the virus runs through these communities. Actually, they might not get as much of an impact from the virus because the virus seems to have spread in places where people had more access to airplanes. So actually the virus might spare them, but the starvation, illiteracy, and poverty might be the thing that gets those southern communities of the world. Martin Luther King, in his letter from the Birmingham jail, says that when government uses moral means to preserve immoral ends, people have to disrupt the status quo. And I really think that this pandemic is calling on us to disrupt the status quo. The universal human rights of everyone and all people have to take precedence over the economic rights of a few. The people who are calling for opening up the economy before we figured out the healthcare issue need to know that we need to keep people safe before we can keep their money safe. So I'll just close by saying that I would argue, as someone who looks at these issues critically, that we have to reclaim the public space. We have to shift from the market back to a notion of care. The national government has to step in and coordinate response to the virus, testing, equipment, antibody testing, vaccines. Healthcare is a human right. Healthcare is a human right. Everyone in this nation and the world has a right to healthcare. Finally, as we move forward, we need a new deal for this country, much like FDR's response to the Great Depression. It is time for a wealth tax on people who have more money than they can spend in their lifetimes. We have to have enhanced support for people who are living through the digital divide, and we need to make sure they have the technology to be able to learn remotely if it's 6 months or a year. We need income support for people who have lost their jobs above and beyond unemployment. Nonprofits have to partner with government, and we have to support our government's support of the IMF and the WHO so that internationally southern nations of the world don't see some of the just disastrous things that can happen with starvation, illiteracy, and continued poverty. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marabella, for that very comprehensive and insightful presentation. We'll now ask Richard Winchester, visiting professor of law at our law school, to give us some additional perspectives on our structure and perhaps small business through legal conceptions. Professor Winchester.
Thank you for having me. And I feel privileged to be amongst everybody else on this panel. And I think my remarks will be a very fitting follow-up on what we just heard from Dr. Carolina and Professor Marabella. So I am a law professor, and I spent most of my time before becoming a law professor actually practicing law in the tax field. So the courses that I teach at the law school range, from business, straight business, to tax law. And my writing is specifically in the small business and employment tax policy space. And what I have been witnessing has given me an opportunity. What I have been witnessing in this moment of the economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic, I think has given me a chance to think very deeply about some of the things that I write about. And it's really helped me, I think, sharpen views I've always held about the way that tax policy has been used to foster economic growth. And this is what I mean when I say that. For really decades, at least dating back to the days of Ronald Reagan, there's been this emphasis, this relentless emphasis on the idea that the tax system should be used to support the owners of capital, to the exclusion of any other factor in the equation. And I always thought that was misdirected and had many sort of negative side effects. And so I want to talk about that today. And so what I'm doing today, I'm naming my presentation People, the Forgotten Factor in the Economic Equation. And this is the point I hope to share with you, is that current tax policy favors capital over labor and producers over consumers, leading to distorted markets, economic inequality, and ultimately dysfunctional government. And so Professor Mirabella has been talking a lot about how we seem to be overemphasizing the public sector power to address, the private sector power to address public ills, I think is intimately connected to why we are, to my presentation today. So let me first with an opening premise, and that it may sound self-explanatory, but I've got to say it, and that is the economy needs people to exist. And I think we have to be very explicit about acknowledging the role that people play in the economic equation on two levels. First, people are an essential part of the inputs of production. When I studied microeconomics in college, the inputs, there are two inputs of production: labor and capital. Labor is people. Up to now, we've been emphasizing capital at the expense of labor, when both should be equally, neither should be favored or disfavored. Okay, so people are an essential part of the microeconomic puzzle in the production equation, right? At the same time, looking at it from a macroeconomic standpoint, when we study macroeconomics, we study markets. And unless things have changed when I was in college, there are two components of a market: buyers and sellers, consumers and producers, right? And these consumer buyers are people, ultimately. I suppose you can have markets where, companies are buying something from each other. But at the end of the day, it is a consumer, it is a person, it is a human being at the end of the line, which is driving the economic activity. And so what we have been witnessing over the last month in our economy collapsing, I think can be explained by the absence of the worker consumer in the equation. People can't go to work, and people don't have the money to spend. And so even if companies could produce the widgets that they want to sell us, consumers don't have the money to buy it. Okay, so I think what we have been witnessing from an economic standpoint is the fact that people are the essential worker consumers, and we cannot ignore the role that they play in the economic equation. But the fact of the matter is, we have been ignoring the role that people play in the economic equation. We've been ignoring it in many ways, but I want to focus on the things that I know about, which is tax policy. tax policy has evolved to where it penalizes the worker consumer while giving subsidies to the owners of capital. This is how it works. Right now, our tax system imposes a top rate of tax of 37% on all of us, right? It starts off at 0, really, and it goes up to 37%. That's what you and I pay on the money we make from our labor. However, if you are lucky enough to be someone who doesn't have to work because you own a lot of stocks and bonds, and you buy and sell those stocks and bonds to generate income for yourself, or you just allow those bonds to pay the dividends that they generate on a regular basis, you don't pay tax at the full rate. You don't pay tax at the maximum 37% rate. In fact, you pay tax at a discount, at almost half the rate. If you are generating income in the form of capital gains or dividends, you are taxed at 15, no more than 20%. Okay, so you have to ask yourself, if we are operating an economic market where we are neither favoring the consumers or the producers or capital or labor, why are we favoring the owners of capital? I don't think we should. There's another way that tax policy favors the owners of capital as opposed to the owners of labor. And that is the way our inheritance tax works. When you die, if you leave a fortune, under current law, the first $11 million is completely tax-free. It is completely tax-free to your heirs. People who work in my business have always thought there should be an exemption for the first dollar that you leave your heirs. But an $11 million exemption is far beyond what is necessary to cover the vast majority of people. Before 2017, the exemption that was in place was only $5 million. Even that was pretty generous. Not many people leave $5 million to their heirs. And even if they did, those heirs, again, this is tax-free money to them. To ask the government to take out a little to help fund necessary programs is not asking too much. The overall point I want to make is this. Right now, we're living in a system that allows multimillionaires to leave at least $11 million tax-free to their heirs. Anyone who already has $11 million to leave to their heirs is probably already being taxed at a discount because their income consists primarily of capital gains and dividends. So the inheritance tax system compounds a problem created by the income tax system. That's not the end of it. Aside from giving a break to the owners of capital, we impose a surtax on labor. How does this happen? Well, it starts with the fact that we're paying labor, workers pay tax at the maximum 37%, depending on your income bracket. But on top of that, we impose a Social Security tax on labor. And it amounts to a 7.65% tax on the first dollar all the way across of the money you make. So when you combine the Social Security tax on top of your income tax, you're being, in a sense, doubly taxed if all your income comes in the form of salaries and wages. And again, that wouldn't be so bad if everyone were being taxed in the same way, but that is not the case. Our tax system has evolved to where we overtax labor and we undertax capital. This upside down tax policy, I think, leads to several undesirable consequences. First, markets are distorted. If we are undertaxing producers and overtaxing the consumers, my question is, who's going to buy all of this stuff that we are encouraging people to produce, and because it appears as if it costs less for them to produce it than it really does. If the government wants to get out of the way of the forces that produce economic activity, they should not favor either consumers or producers. That's not to say that nobody should be taxed, but that everyone should be taxed at the same rate. That is not what's happened now. So we have distortions. The owners of capital make out, the worker consumer does not. There's a second undesirable consequence. We have economic disparities that are created and that are accelerated as a result of this upside down tax policy that we have in this country. Because the rich get richer and the rich get richer faster. Once you have money, once you reach a certain level of wealth, it is just a matter of recycling that wealth. And the more you have, the richer you will get, which is why you see over the course of the past several years and decades, the gap between the haves and the have-nots has been expanding. And there's not a day that goes by where you do not see a statistic explaining about how small the top 1% is and how much wealth they possess and control compared to the bottom 90%. That gap has been getting larger, in part because once you get rich, it's easier to get richer. And this tax system is accelerating that divide. We need a tax policy that does not operate in that way. And there's a final adverse consequence produced by this series of events. And that is, at the end of the day, we have dysfunctional government because the people with money control the levers of power. And they're doing it in ways to enrich themselves and to expand their own power. And some of the ways they do that is by controlling the messages that we receive. One of the messages is that we have to lay off the owners of capital. We have to let them loose so that they can create more jobs. That, I'm going to argue, is a fiction. It's only partially true because worker consumers are an essential element of the economic equation. And for the past several decades, government policy has failed to acknowledge it. And what we see today in terms of the economy that has ground to a halt, it's because people are absent from the equation. And so what I hope this moment helps us do is to fully appreciate something that has always been true, which is that people matter. People matter just as much as capital. They both are interlinked in the production process. They both are interlinked in the markets that we rely on to keep our economy going. And so going forward, my hope is that policymakers use this moment to reconsider the direction that government policy and tax policy in particular has been going. No longer should we favor producers and capital over the consumer worker. We all need to pay taxes because we all benefit from government in one way or another. And we should all pay taxes at the same rate under an equitable system. We don't have that now. We need to have that going forward. And my hope is that this moment is an opportunity for us to reconsider where things are going and to set a new course for ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Winchester, for that very insightful analysis. I hope many students who are maybe listening to this have picked up some very valuable concepts. You have set forth an excellent model and paradigm. And for many of us who probably have very little insight sometimes to the mechanisms and the impacts of policy, you made it exceptionally clear. We are very appreciative of your detailed thought and analysis. We'll now turn to Kyle Younger from the School of Diplomacy, where he is the Director of Professional Services. And I know the School of Diplomacy is about the business of producing peacemakers for the world. So let's see how he will share with us lessons that are being learned from the pandemic.
Okay, I'm having a little trouble sharing my images. Is Burke around to put that up?
What is the title of your presentation, Kyle?
It just says Younger. Yep.
Sure. Yep, I'll take care of it.
Okay. So I'm going to make some adjustments to my presentation for the sake of time. As Dr. Pritchett mentioned, I'm the Director of Professional Services in the School of Diplomacy and International Relations. And so thank you, Dr. Pritchett, for allowing me to make my humble contribution to this great discussion. I research career development. This is what I do in the School of Diplomacy. I help students determine how they want to use their skills that they gain in international relations to make a difference. And I research career development through a lens of critical race theory, looking at employment outcomes for undergraduate Black men, and looking at socially fair employment. And so that's part of my background. In my practice, I use critical reflection. And so my presentation is more of a reflection than to discuss a particular theory per se. If I could have the next slide. So what COVID-19, as I look at through my critical reflection, I'm looking at what has been uncovered in America. This hero narrative that we've been hearing about healthcare workers and frontline workers, and then what do I hope to see come out of this pandemic? And so the pandemic has revealed a lot about America, and over the past months, I've watched the news, attended virtual conferences that pose a similar question about lessons learned. One series that I attend regularly is from the African American Policy Forum, led by critical race scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. She also frames these conversations around intersectionality. And like many of her guests, I am not surprised at some of the issues that have come up. Many in the African American and Black and Brown community have always talked about some of the health disparities, the lack of health care, poor pay at their jobs. And it's because of this national nature of the pandemic, people are starting to acknowledge it when it was denied for so long. And understanding how a person's vocation influences so many aspects of their lives, where they live, their health, their social mobility. You can see all these issues that we've heard earlier that have been kind of swept under the rug. We've talked about these structural inequalities, racist policies such as redlining, segregation by income and race, this digital divide. Other day, I read an article that I saw online about students in Philadelphia who do not have access to Wi-Fi and the school system encouraged them to go to the school parking lot to use Wi-Fi. And so you see this pandemic affecting their education, the health disparities. Um, One of the things that I heard after the Surgeon General went on and spoke about Big Ma and Papa was that is an example of how this virus has been weaponized toward pre-existing racism. Um, in essence, saying that there's something wrong with Black and brown bodies, or something wrong with the way they live their lives, something wrong with the way they live, instead of actually diving further into why these disparities exist. And a lot of times we are afraid to say it. It's difficult to say it because people will say, "Oh boy, here we go again with the topic of racism." But historian Ibram Kendi said this is why we have these issues. Racism is why these issues exist today. Could I have the next slide, please? We also have a crisis in leadership at the federal level, and this whole idea of government and what government means. As mentioned earlier, during the 80s, a lot of these social safety net programs were attacked and removed, and the Republican Party essentially has been successful at that. This idea of freedom and liberty for some and not others. There are people protesting minor inconveniences with automatic weapons. I heard one person that was interviewed saying, "The police stopped my husband and son just for trying to live their lives." Well, isn't this the same thing that Colin Kaepernick was talking about when he decided to kneel, to talk about how people are just trying to live their lives? And so there has been this this sense of entitlement that you've seen show up from some people, and that they are willing to let people die in order to get back to business. And so we have to question what our priorities are, and whose life has value. These things I reflected on as I'm watching what is happening through this coronavirus. Next slide, please. Which brings me to my second point, this hero's narrative. I was recently listening to a podcast that one of my friends hosts, and he was talking to his guests about how when he goes to the supermarket or rides public transportation, how he now thanks these frontline workers. These frontline workers are often in these racialized jobs, cashiers at supermarkets, postal workers, in the service industry, and they're all at risk of exposing themselves to COVID-19. And I've recently gone to supermarkets, and I tell you, sometimes those thank yous seem like it's the thing to do because it is the thing to do at this time. It seems patronizing and inauthentic. And so all of a sudden, these essential workers are heroes when they had been invisible to many people just 40 days or so ago. And so it speaks something about the underbelly of what's really happening in this country. The Duke professor and sociologist, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, stated that the hero framework is ideological warfare that doesn't allow people to think about the structural changes necessary to protect frontline workers. And he has a point. These workers are Black and brown, they're women, some are undocumented, they're often underpaid. They often express concern about decent pay, health insurance, student loan forgiveness, affordable housing. These are structural problems. But as soon as they express them, these needs or desires they want, instead of heroes, they become villains. And so he said it's very, very important to be careful about how we view this hero narrative of these essential workers. Next slide. My last point, as I'm going to shorten this presentation, is that I reflected on what I would like to see when this is over. As I study the influence of race on career development has its origins in social justice. And so I'm hoping that we take a look at what's socially fair employment. Will the employers require an undergraduate degree for entry-level employment? Some of the research that I found, I noticed that a lot of these entry-level jobs don't actually require a bachelor's degree. Yet it's very difficult for minority people to get in those jobs because they're seen as unqualified. Obviously, I hope that, not just Black and brown people have socially fair employment, but that everybody has this opportunity to receive decent pay, universal Wi-Fi. And essentially, I would like to see a new civil rights movement because, as Professor Mirabello mentioned, some of the government programs that are upcoming, Black and brown people are unlikely to benefit from. And so it's very important that not only do we take these policies in account, but maybe we were on to something with certain campaigns and Black Lives Matter, where we need to make this a movement. And maybe a lesson learned from the COVID-19 virus is that we should make this a new civil rights movement. So the last slide, I would like to just close with a quote that I read it in the editorial in the Chicago Sun-Times by a woman named Rosemary Callahan. And I'll just close my little contribution with her quote and it says, "I do not want to go back to normal. I want this pandemic to upset our society to the point that things change for the better exponentially. Let this radicalize you. We can bring about a new normal. The status quo is no longer an option." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Younger. That was extremely clear and extremely valuable, particularly in an environment in which we are preparing young people to go forward with careers. But having them with a moral grounding is very, very clear perception. So we want to thank you for that contribution. Our next presenter is Professor Angela Katsonis from the School of Communications, who is an extraordinary conveyor through the human arts of liberation from the things which surround us. And she also is the founder of the annual Speak with Conviction, the Martin Luther King Oratorical Festival for the Petersheim Academic Expo. So we now welcome Professor Katsonis. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, very much.
All right, so I'm a performance artist and I happen to be working in a field that's being decimated right now. Artists and artistry has always found itself to be resilient. And I really think I'm waiting for artists to see how will we remember and contextualize this moment. So because I'm a communication person about rhetoric, about language, the stories we tell now will determine the action that we will take. So about language, I would encourage all of us to ban the phrase new normal. from the way that we discuss this current moment. There's nothing normal about it. It's abusive to try to normalize everything that's happening, to try to push us to get used to it, to adjust it, or even worse, to ignore it. We are not online learning. We're not distance learning. We are following an executive order, shelter in place to quarantine. It's a state of emergency. Oh no.
Just take your time. Are you okay? All right.
Reverend Pritchett, it looks like her screen froze.
Yes.
So we might have to circle back.
Gotcha. So I'm going to begin to ask Dr. Harris, who's Director of Africana Studies at the university.
Actually, it looks like we might have her back.
Okay.
If y'all moved on, you can move on. That's my fault for getting kicked out. My internet's fault.
We're good, Angela. If you like to continue now.
Okay, I'm gonna move through it real quick before I get kicked out again. There's nothing new about this moment. There have always been bodies that have moved through this country at high risk, protecting their bodies, living in a state of crisis, always in survival mode, questioning the government, a distrust of the government. Let's watch our language. We are not in this together. We are in this together. We are not in this together. We are in the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. There are entire swaths of this population that live in flight, fright, freeze, or fawn. There are some folk who might appear calm. Moving in a state of calm through this moment is a trauma response. There are folk who live in a constant state of anxiety. The anxiety is always activated. At the same time, there are entire swaths of this population that are not affected at all. What is not important to one segment of the population might be very significant to others. So really collecting stories, taking inventory of the different ways that are affecting different people will be important, especially all of us here at this university, so we know how best to deploy our resources and how we can be of service. Not in the same boat, not going through this together in the same way. About the protesters, Georgia's opening today. That is the protesters demanding the reopening of the economy is an example of white privilege. The audacity, the wanting to access other people's labor. Not only do they want to go back to work, they are demanding other people to go back to work so they are able to access that labor to work for them. The language of essential workers. It's sacrificial workers. I have a hard time, like the speaker said before, watching the 7 p.m. applause or the concert fundraisers. These are performative actions. A performance or a gesture elicits a response in the audience. I perform a gesture like clapping or saying thank you so other people can witness it and I can get credit for that. But when the gesture is over, I really didn't do much of anything. What would really matter is raising the minimum wage. Not connecting health insurance with employment. If we really want to help nurses, we could wipe away their student debt. The language of going back to the way things were. I want to go back to the way things were. I can't wait for us to go back to the way things were. Like what was said before, there's nothing about the way things were that we should want to get back to. The reason why we are in this crisis moment is because of the moment that happened before. How can I or anyone be for social justice or social change and love or miss anything about the current moment? I tell my students, how can we use this as an opportunity to reframe? How can we look at this as an opportunity? When systems break down, we can build something new from that rubble. Let's take a look at this moment and ask ourselves, what can happen here? What is the new thing that can emerge? Beware, next point, the rhetoric of productivity. This quarantine is not a writing retreat. Sheltering in place in my house does not make me an artist in residence. I hear a lot of articles by white writers talking, trying to make us feel better about the uncomfortability that we're feeling in our solitude. Our lack of introspection, the inability for ourselves to self-reflect or to sit still. The joy that I have seen online has been in Black spaces. I'll give you an example, #ClubQuarantine with D Nice, a Black DJ spinning Black music for Black listeners. These communal spaces for gathering have always been sought, carved, and protected by and for Black folk. Joy is the greatest act of resistance, literally playing music and dancing, banishing hopelessness. The saddest thing that can happen from this moment is no change. The most shameful thing is not allowing us to look at this as an opportunity and build something new. And that's what artists do. Artists just have the audacity of calling themselves artists, but everybody has the ability to be artistic. And to be artistic really requires looking at something and trying to find the possibility in the moment. So I ask all of you, we can all create. What will you make? I ask my students, what will you make from and out of this moment? There is a new world that could possibly emerge. What are we contributing to that new world? I made it before my internet cut out again.
Thank you, and just God bless you for your enthusiasm for life, your passion. You are a true sister on the battlefield for social justice. We will now turn to Dr. Kelly Harris, Director of Africana Studies at the university. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon.
Yes, sir.
I'm very, can you all hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, very well.
Okay. I'm very energized by the presentations that everybody's been doing. I'm in total agreement with what everybody's been saying. And I won't be long. I wasn't going to do a PowerPoint, so I just threw together a couple of slides to illustrate the point I'm trying to make. So do you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we do.
Okay. So one, I wanted to say, well, thank you first, Dr. Pritchett, for allowing me to participate in this discussion today. Second, I want to say that, it's hard for me not to come to this discussion angry over what's happening in the world. And, COVID-19 to me is just exacerbating problems that have already been there. Dr. Carolina and Dr. Marabella and the other presenters really talked about the structural issues that I think have been very problematic. And so for me, this quote from Dr. King, "The nation is sick, trouble is in the land, confusion all around." Dr. King said this a long time ago, and I said a long time ago I wasn't going to use the word racism anymore. I still do. But the reason I said that, I said I was going to just say that the nation is sick. And that really, I think, because sometimes when we talk about racism, there's a knee-jerk reaction. People say, oh, you're pulling the race card, oh, you can't blame racism. But the nation is sick. And sickness, racism is a sickness. White supremacy is a sickness. And so I want to get to really what Dr. King and Nelson Mandela were trying to deal with, trying to confront this sickness. So when I look at this sickness, and this is where the other presenters really talked about the structural problems. I'm talking about violence, abstract violence. And this is what COVID-19 is really exacerbating, this abstract violence. And I think the problem in our society is that oftentimes we don't see these forms of abstract violence as violence. But these forms of abstract violence are just as debilitating, just as deadly as somebody shooting you in the head. So we are able to react when we see a dead body on the street. We all have empathy and sympathy. We say there's a problem in society when we see that somebody's shot. I came here from Chicago, and there was always the news was always led about how many people are being killed in Chicago. The news was never led about how many food deserts were in Chicago. The news was never led about the predatory lending in Chicago. The news was never led about the miseducation and devaluing education in Chicago. The news was never led about the high unemployment rates in Chicago. It was always the physical violence that people focused on. But it's these abstract forms of violence that I think that we really need to pay attention to and treat just as deadly and debilitating as physical forms of violence. And I think that when we really meditate on Dr. King and Nelson Mandela, that they really were trying to get only not just as physical violence, but more abstract forms of violence. Not only that, when people talk about social justice, and as eloquently as Sister Angela just did, when people talk about issues of social justice, we're really talking about dealing with these forms of abstract violence, and physical and abstract violence that we just don't deal with. COVID-19 is exacerbating all these issues, limited access to good health care. It's exacerbating that, and that's been talked about today very eloquently by the other presenters. So what I want us to consider when we look at Nelson Mandela and when we look at Dr. King, we cannot separate them from the milieu from which they were in, the times from which they were in. We cannot separate them from that. They were exceptional individuals, but they also came during a time when exceptional individuals were a part of what they were doing. They came out of a community where people were really struggling and working together. So you see this ANC, Nelson Mandela, along with these four other gentlemen, Anton Lebende right here down in the corner, Walter Sisulu at the top, Oliver Tambo right here to the left corner. Nelson Mandela formed the ANC Youth League with these individuals, and they pushed the ANC to have a program of action, of civil disobedience, of strikes and boycotts. They pushed them to do this in 1949. In 1949. So they pushed for full citizenship, redistribution of land, trade union rights, free and compulsory education for all children. And I'm showing this to say that we have to remind our students, our youth, that Nelson Mandela didn't just fall from the sky. Nelson Mandela just isn't an aberration. Nelson Mandela was a part of a group of youth who were organizing and who were pushing to really transform and deal with the structural inequities that was in South Africa and other places. And when we look at Dr. King, I think we go back to his letter from a Birmingham jail. And I think this quote is so appropriate when we look at what's happening around the world, because this COVID-19 crisis, America was slow to react. We were slow to respond. When it was happening in China, when it was happening in Europe, we were sitting watching and saying, wow, well, we didn't react. We didn't have the same sympathy and empathy that we had when it hits home in the United States. And we failed to remember what Dr. King said a long time ago in a letter from a Birmingham jail. In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. And we have to remember that. We have to remember that when Dr. King spoke, the way he lived his life, Dr. King believed that I cannot be considered a success while poverty exists. I cannot be considered a success while people are living in dilapidated conditions and struggling under the brute oppression of racism and white supremacy. I cannot be a success living in a sick society. I cannot. And we have to remember that from Dr. King and Nelson Mandela. So I think this moment when we really try to reflect on COVID-19 and its impact on all people, we have to remember that we are intricately tied in a mutual web of destiny. And that is my few seconds.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. That was profound. I'm going to take a minute now. A number of questions came in, and I'm going to direct just two questions. One will be to Dr. Marabella. Are you still present?
Yep, I'm here.
Thank you. This came in from Nick. He says, do you see this crisis as an opportunity for nonprofits to consolidate and combine resources? And would that be a good or a bad thing?
Yeah, thanks, Nick, for your question. One of the reasons why collaboration and cooperation and partnerships are a buzzword is it's a trend of the continued managerialization and marketization of the nonprofit sector. And so let me just give you an example. The Ys in my county here in New Jersey recently merged, and we now have one county YMCA instead of YMCAs in all the different towns. As a result, the board distribution is now done by financial input, which means that those wealthier districts have more seats on the board than communities that don't have as much wealth. As a result, we sort of have a fabulous facility here in my town in the Somerset Hills, which is quite wealthy, and Franklin Township, which is a community with more working class and poor folks, has absolutely no facilities at all. And when we asked if they would be building a facility in Franklin, they said Franklin will have to raise the money to do that. So collaboration and consolidation will often mean that marginalized communities will continue to be marginalized. So that's not necessarily a good thing. That's my caution.
Thank you so much. Professor Winchester, we have a question from Martha, and she'd like to ask, how can we get fair taxation as an issue in the upcoming election?
Yes, thank you, Martha, for your question. I think if you look back at, every presidential election, it involves taxation as an issue. I think taxation is an issue in the current election. It is probably going to be overshadowed by some other things, but taxation is always something that is on people's mind because it deals with money in their pocket. One of the points I made in my presentation is that we have been lulled into believing that good tax policy equates into tax cuts for the rich. And what I'm suggesting is that you have been fooled. America has been fooled. Tax cuts for the rich do not equate into good jobs for everybody else. In fact, it produces just the opposite. And so when the politicians start talking about tax cuts, I think the response from journalists and from voters should be, for whom? And if the response from the politician is that, well, we need to make rich people richer before we can make poor people better off, then you should vote for someone else. Because that's someone who not only does not have your best interests at heart, that's someone who doesn't even know basic economics. That was the point of my presentation. Basic economics teaches us that the government should not interfere with markets. And right now, they are interfering with markets. They are interfering with markets by placing their thumbs on the scales in favor of capital, by placing their thumbs on in favor of producers. We need both. Producers, I'm not suggesting that we need to favor consumers over producers or labor over capital. I'm suggesting that tax policy should be neutral. Right now it's not, and questions from journalists should be focused on this. Questions from voters should be focused on this. The politicians will not articulate their answers or their policy responses in this way until voters and journalists began demanding that they do so.
Thank you so much, Professor Winchester. As we begin to close out, I want to thank everybody for, this has been a learning experience for all of us, not only living through our circumstances, which is actually nothing new for Black folk and the highly oppressed in this country, but leaning together to build a new humanity. I often mention to my students and others, out of every crisis moment, it molds an entire generation of people. So the question becomes, how will all of this mold you? How will this mold you? And in closing, I'd like to go to our two namesakes for the day and remind us all in their own words. Dr. King once said that the presence of injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And Madiba, Nelson Mandela, has said, the social equality is the only basis for human happiness. On behalf of the Peter Shine Academic Expo, I want to thank all of you for your participation. And God willing, we'll see you all on campus, and perhaps we'll see you again here next year as we launch the Mandela King Symposium on Global Justice. Thank you so much for your time and attention. May God be with all of us. Good night.
Thank you.